parts because it's a long career and it covers material in South Carolina and Florida and Georgia and Alabama a little bit, but mostly about William Augustus Edwards and his various partnerships. And William Edwards established his Atlanta architectural practice in 1908 when he was 42, but he had been active as an architect since 1893. He is an almost exact contemporary of Frank Lloyd Wright, who was 6 months younger. Edwards is best known for his educational buildings, particularly college buildings, but also designs for secondary education, although he also designed numerous county courthouses throughout the Southeast. His work is found mostly in Florida, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Edwards was a native South Carolinian. He was born in Darlington, South Carolina, and although he died in Atlanta, he is buried in his native state of South Carolina in Columbia's Elmwood Memorial Gardens. Edwards attended Richmond College in Virginia, which is now the University of Richmond, for 1 year, and then he entered the University of South Carolina, which at the time was the South Carolina College at Columbia, where he received a degree in mechanical engineering in 1889. At age 32, he married India Pearl Brown. They had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Around 1893, Edwards entered the office of architect Charles Coker Wilson in Roanoke, serving as a draftsman. He remained in Virginia for 3 years. Wilson remained in Virginia for 3 years, but a job as city engineer and superintendent of waterworks drew him to Columbia by 1896. During this period, Wilson's office completed the first Presbyterian church in Rock Hill, which is what we're looking at on the screen, a picturesque Romanesque revival sanctuary with a massive bell tower, round-headed windows with exaggerated voussoirs, corbelling, and principal windows, each featuring an 8-petaled geometric rose. Wilson's young apprentice, William Edwards, may well have worked on this church. Like Edwards, Wilson was a native of Darlington County, South Carolina, and the Darlington Graded School, designed in 1900 by the then new partnership of Edwards and Wilson, may well be the first of countless school buildings Edwards would design in his long career as a school architect. Edwards had followed Wilson from Roanoke to Lynchburg, Virginia in 1895, and by 1896 the two had established an architectural partnership in Columbia, and that would last until 1901, a period of 5 years in which they produced some 50 buildings, some 10 a year on average. Among these were the Masonic Temple of Columbus, the People's Bank of Anderson, South Carolina, and 2 Gothic Revival churches, the First Baptist Church of Sumter, now the Brown Chapel, which is on the left, and the First Baptist Church in Selma, Alabama, from 1901 to 4 on the right. In 1900, while still associated with Edwards in Columbia, Wilson left Columbia and traveled abroad to study at the Atelier Duret at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and to tour Europe, leaving Edwards to direct the partnership's business. Wilson and Edwards dissolved their partnership in 1901, and throughout the rest of his career, Wilson operated mainly from his office in Columbia, taking on a variety of partners in practices that accepted commissions across the Carolinas into Virginia, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. And also in 1901, Wilson began his, began his career, extensive professional work, serving as a founding member and charter president of the South Carolina Association of Architects. Now, this is Edwards' partner, Wilson, who's doing this. That association became the South Carolina chapter of the AIA, the American Institute of Architects. Wilson became a member of the National AIA in 1905. He served as charter president of AIA South Carolina from 1913 to 1914 and was named a fellow of the AIA in 1914. He then served as the first chairman of the South Carolina Board of Architectural Examiners, on which he served from 1917 to 1933, and helped to draft the state's first building code. So Edwards had a pretty talented partner in those early years involved in those professional activities. This is just going too fast. On the screen now is a list of dates and architectural partnerships that summarizes William Edwards' professional affiliations, and we'll trace these in two parts, both tonight and in part two to follow on September 17th. Put it down on your calendars. We'll see you again, hopefully. When his association with Wilson ended in 1901, Edwards established a new partnership, joining Frank C. Walter in Columbia and specializing in public school buildings. South Carolina at the time was inaugurating a statewide program of public school construction. And between 1902 and 1905, Walter and Edwards prepared 16 standard public school designs for the South Carolina State Board of Education, ranging from one-room buildings to two-story schools with 10 rooms, indoor plumbing, and an auditorium. And adaptations appeared in a range of South Carolina counties: Lawrence, Union, Belton, Greenville, Pelzer, Greer, and Walhalla. Born in 1870 in Alton, Illinois, and that's interesting to me because I went to college in a school that was about 15 miles from Alton, Illinois. Walter designed his most prominent previous building before joining Edwards in 1895, and this was the Union Terminal in Savannah. That older railroad station was replaced by Frank Pierce Milburn's 1902 Union Station, which stood for quite a long time until the interstate caused it to be raised in 1962. Edwards and Walter then moved to Atlanta in 1908, but Walter ultimately struck out on his own in 1911 and moved to Oklahoma. His practice in Tulsa extended from 1917 to 1947, where he also served as city building inspector, and ultimately died in 1953, 14 years after Edwards' death. In 1912, the year after Walter's departure, William J. Sayward moved to Atlanta, and soon thereafter joined Edwards, forming the successful firm of Edwards and Sayward, and that's the firm we most know in terms of Georgia work, and certainly Atlanta work. William James Sayward was born in Woodstock, Vermont. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree in 1897 from the University of Vermont, immediately entered MIT, and graduated in 1901 with a degree in architecture. He worked briefly in New York for a time with McKim, Mead, and White, and records at the J.P. Morgan Library indicate that Sayward served as a draftsman, detailing the ornament on the rotunda dome ceiling of the J.P. Morgan Library Hall. He was married in 1904 and had 2 daughters, and from 1908 to 1912, Sayward was in Seattle, and then he joined Edwards in Atlanta in the prominent architectural practice of Edwards and Sayward that continued to thrive until Edwards' death in 1939. And finally, Robert B. Logan was associated with Edwards and Sayward and their projects during the 1930s, and from 1939, with Edwards' death, building designs such as Presser Hall at Agnes Scott College or the Allen Wilson Terrace public housing that used to be right down the street from us in Decatur in 1940, these began to be credited to Sayward and Logan. Sayward died at the age of 70, 2 days before Christmas in 1945, and it's interesting, as a major architect in Atlanta, that his pallbearers at the funeral included Robert Logan, architect, Daniel Bodine, architect, and Francis Smith, architect. Logan died in 1962 and is buried in Oakland Cemetery. So that's the kind of overview of who's who and when that we'll be treating in 2 days, 2 different sessions. The primary individual in these several affiliations between 1895 and 1939, of course, was William A. Edwards, one of the primary architects of educational buildings in the southeastern U.S. during the early 20th century. Distinguished academic buildings in South Carolina designed by Edwards include, and we'll look at a number of these over some time. This is just a couple of views of one of the early ones and one of the really late ones, but they include work at Winthrop College, at Limestone College, at Furman University, and at the University of South Carolina. In Florida, at Florida State College for Women, which became Florida State University, at Florida College for Negroes that became Florida A&M, and the University of Florida at Gainesville, which is still the University of Florida at Gainesville. And in Georgia, at the Georgia State Women's College, which is now Valdosta State University, and at Agnes Scott, and at Columbia Theological Seminary. A late work completed in 1933 is the brick building on the screen, the Gothic Revival Tallapoosa Hall at Camp Hill, Alabama. It's not a lot of work in Alabama, but this is one of his projects, erected for the Southern Industrial Institute that was later renamed the Lyman Ward Military Academy. And since 2019, the school is called the Southern Preparatory Academy. In addition, Edwards designed county courthouses in the same southeastern states. In South Carolina, in the following counties: Abbeville, Calhoun, Darlington. The Darlington one is raised. Dillon, Kershaw. The Kershaw is also gone. Jasper, Lee, Sumter, and York counties. And in Florida, in Hernando County and Sumter County, and in Georgia, in Fannin County and Tift County. All of his courthouses were neoclassical, either with pedimented porticos suggesting temple fronts, or loggias with colonnades in antis, which means they're sort of in between two walls, creating a recessed loggia. While his educational buildings often look to English medieval precedent, referencing Tudor forms from Hampton Court to the universities at Oxford and Cambridge, which of course was a popular mode for doing school buildings in this country. An early work of Edwards, completed during his partnership with Charles Coker Wilson, was the 1899 to 1900 Alumni Memorial Hall on the now raised downtown campus of Furman University. The building featured a central dome on an octagonal base, crowning the main body of the building, composed as a first-floor rusticated base and smooth masonry piano nobile above. A pedimented frontispiece marked the entry, with 3 round arches, each capped by exaggerated voussoirs and keystone, a treatment repeated in the side windows. The frontispiece's upper level was treated as a pedimented temple front with acroteria, engaged pilasters doubled at the end, and 3 cerulean or Venetian apertures in the intercolumniation. The compact composition of the building form brought a weighty monumentality to the structure, and the design expertise evidenced in its proportions and ornament established a solid footing for Edwards's school career. The building contained 2 lecture rooms, 2 spacious halls for the Adelphian and Philosophian societies, and a large auditorium seating nearly 1,000. You can see the interior of the auditorium in black and white. Alumni Memorial Hall was noted as well for 15 opal art glass memorial windows manufactured by F.J. Coolidge Art Glass Company of Atlanta, many of which were preserved and are today exhibited in the Pitts Room of the library and elsewhere on Furman's current campus in suburban Greenville. Works emerging from the Walter and Edwards partnership include, and again we'll look at several of these, but the Valhalla Graded School, the State Armory Building, and Lincoln High School, now the Lincoln Neighborhood Center, both in Tallahassee, Buckman Hall and Thomas Hall, and the now raised original post office at the University of Florida in Gainesville, as well as Flint Hall, Bryan Hall and Carnegie Library at the Florida Women's College, which is FSU, and 4 South Carolina courthouses for Darlington, Sumter, Abbeville, and Lee. All those are Edwards buildings, but during that Walter and Edwards partnership, and they date from about 1900 to this latest one. Lee is in Flint Hall at University of Florida is 1910. Now, much of this work will be discussed in a minute in relationship to Edwards' designs for education at both the secondary and the university level. But there's an interesting building from 1905 that still survives in Columbia, the 1905 State Armory. It might otherwise be passed over due to the simplicity and apparent ordinariness of its design. It lacks any decorative application or trim or color textural contrast, and thus appears as a minimally articulated brick commercial warehouse. On the other hand, the Armory has been recognized as significant in embracing a new architectural style that moves away from historicism. It follows the federalization of the National Guard, an image that no longer looks to medieval crenellated models, and I'm showing below an armory of the exact same year from Rochester, New York, that's still extant, that is typical of those medieval fortress-like armories that were being built around the country. The main facade of Edwards building is a simplified organization in three plain vertical bays, subtle projection of bricks, in framing a vertical stack of windows. It lends a kind of rationalist refinement to the utilitarian composition. The brickwork displays an ordinary running bond pattern except for the main facade, which features alternating headers and stretchers on every 8th course. That's a pretty common building practice. Inscribed on the main facade in panels above the entry and below the central upper windows are the date, 1905, and the inscription, South Carolina State Armory. Otherwise, there's not a hint of architectural ornamentation beyond the subtle projection of bricks. The National Guard moved to a new building in 1864, and in 1985, the still extant Walters, it's still there, the Walters and Edwards Armory building was renovated by the architecture and engineering firm of Hussey Gay Bell, which I presume they're housing their own offices there. One of Edwards' early buildings, in partnership with architect Frank Walter, is a 1901-2 red brick Valhalla, I'm not sure how they pronounce it in South Carolina, graded school, mentioned above, and now the Civic Auditorium and Performing Arts Center for Valhalla, South Carolina. The symmetrical south elevation features a frontispiece entry bay that's capped by a curvilinear gable, lending a simplified Flemish character to the otherwise restrained block, lacking any ornament except the pilaster flanking the entry. There are two hipped roof side wings flank the hipped roof central block. The west wing along the North College Street is built with the original 1901 central block. The east wing and the rear auditorium were not erected till 1913 to 14, but all of those pieces that extend back in a U-plan are following Edwards' original design, even though they came a little bit later. Edwards' school designs in South Carolina continued with his 1904 design for Winnie Davis Hall, an early building at Limehouse College and an edifice now housing the campus's Hall of History. Limehouse was founded in 1845. It was the first women's college in South Carolina. The college was established when Dr. Thomas Curtis purchased a circa 1838 resort hotel at Limestone Springs. It's still extant behind this great columned main administration building and is the oldest building on campus. In 1899, the Curtis Building, which is the admin building, featuring a rectangular central tower with ornamented pediment and ribbed dome, was attached to the four-story hotel. And to provide a monumental new facade, a new two-story pedimented portico with colossal Roman door columns, albeit somewhat ill-proportioned, were added in 1939. And this classical temple front has remained the campus's axial focal point at the end of College Drive even to today. But off to one side is the building by Edwards. As recently as 2020, the college officially changed its name to Limestone University as opposed to college. You know, they're all doing that. They upgrade themselves from college to university. So in 1903 to 4, this limestone building, Limestone College building, Winnie Davis Hall, was constructed and sited by Edwards in anticipation of other building additions that would flank College Drive and help form a grand avenue or open quadrangle space focusing on the Curtis Administration Building. Edwards crowned his own cruciform brick Victorian Gothic building with a polygonal lantern that, like a mini state house, shapes an octagonal crossing of short wings beneath an octagonal domed skylight. The lantern is crenellated on the exterior and opens inside to a rotunda space surrounded by balustraded corridors, which serve as a central circulation for classrooms and exhibition space, and those exhibition spaces now display the college's history. The success of Edwards' work at Furman, at Valhalla, and at Limehouse likely influenced the decision in Florida to name Edwards as the principal architect for Florida colleges, following the establishment of the State University System of Florida in 1905. So he's had these 2 or 3 early college buildings on the basis of those buildings. He gets hired as the state architect of Florida, effectively, for school buildings. And between 1905 and 1925, William Edwards served as architect for the Florida Board of Control, and in that capacity designed many of the early buildings of the 3 existing state universities, the institutions of higher learning in Florida, as well as public schools in the state. His University of Florida buildings were in the collegiate Gothic style and influenced the continued employment of that image by subsequent campus architects, even in Gainesville. So there's a long continuity of collegiate Gothic architecture at Gainesville. And indeed, his 1924 auditorium building on the Gainesville campus, which you see a postcard of here, resembled a monumental Gothic cathedral with a nave, transepts, and crossing spire. There it is on the interior with this extraordinary truss ceiling, a vast hammer beam truss ceiling that marks the interior. Rudolph Weaver succeeded Edwards in 1925 as the architect for the Florida Board of Control until his death in 1944, and he continued some of that same language. Between 1907 and 1925, Edwards designed every building and oversaw campus planning at the University of Florida. Rolfe's Hall at Gainesville, completed in 1927, was designed by Edwards and completed by Weaver. Then Weaver went on to design the university's Walter and Lee Halls, Sheld Hall, the Infirmary, Dower Hall, Fletcher Hall, Murphy Hall, various other ones that lead into the 1930s. And thus the historic character of the architecture of the University of Florida at Gainesville was formed over a period of 3.5 decades by just 2 architects, William Edwards and Rudolph Weaver. Similarly, Edwards served during the school's early years as the sole campus architect for Florida State College for Women, now Florida State University in Tallahassee. There, Edwards designed Bryan Hall in 1907 and Westcott, the original administration building, the one in the red brick there, in 1911, and Reynolds Hall, and then on the lower level, the Swanee Dining Hall, both 1913, among other buildings there at FSU. Then at Florida A&M University, he designed the 1907 Carnegie Library, a handsome building with tetrastyle portico, that means 4-column portico, of fluted ionic columns erected on the former site of Duval Hall. Florida A&M was known as the State Normal and Industrial College for Colored Students when its early library was located in Duval Hall, the former mansion of the Florida governor, William Duval, and the grandest building on the campus. Duval Hall also housed the university's administration offices and cafeteria, but it was destroyed by fire in 1905. The city of Tallahassee planned to build a new city library, which philanthropist Andrew Carnegie offered to fund, but the city refused the gift due to Carnegie's stipulation that it would have to serve black patrons as well as whites. Instead, Carnegie donated his $10,000 for the construction of the college library at the State Normal Industrial College for Colored Students at Florida A&M. Today, Edwards' Carnegie Library building at Florida A&M houses the Meek Eaton Black Archives Research Center and Museum that collects and preserves African American history and culture in the Southeast in support of research and public education, a kind of interesting piece of karma that kind of works its way around. Edwards' most notable collection of 20th century collegiate architecture is his work at the University of Florida, where some dozen Edwards buildings contribute to the campus historic district which is on the National Register with 31 buildings. In 1889 and 2008, different ones were placed on the register, although many had earlier been individually listed. Buckman Hall is the earliest, with Thompson Hall, and we're looking at Buckman on the left and Thompson on the right, following immediately, both from 1906, the year the school opened. The university's first two buildings followed the passage of the Florida legislature of the Buckman Act, which established the new state university at Gainesville as part of a reorganization of the state university system. The first two buildings accommodated all the functions of the new school, including administrative offices, classrooms, and dormitories. Buckman Hall, which contained a cafeteria and a gymnasium and an infirmary, and briefly was the home of the university president, has been used exclusively as a dormitory since the 1940s. Thomas Hall, named for the mayor of Gainesville, provided facilities for housing, offices, classrooms, and dining, and was renovated in 1984 and converted to dormitory space exclusively. Both these structures were styled in a simplified collegiate Gothic of brick with stone trim, polygonal bays, crenellated parapets, and Tudor arches over entries, each building forming an extended I in plan. Immediately following Gainesville's Buckman and Thompson Hall, Edwards designed an early building for the Florida State College for Women, now Florida State University in Tallahassee. This is Bryan Hall. Formed in brick with stone trim and crenellation, featuring an entry of 3 Tudor arches flanked by crenellated towers, Bryan Hall establishes the precedent for collegiate Gothic architecture on this campus as well for 40 years. Bryan Hall was the Women's College's first residence hall, maintaining its dormitory function until 1969, when a fire in Westcott Hall prompted the move of administrative offices to Bryan between 69 and 97. In 97, Bryan Hall again became a dormitory. Oops, don't go so fast here. Excuse me, this is sort of changing itself before it wants to. In 1913, he followed with the design of Reynolds Hall on the left, and in 1917, the Brower Residential Hall. Also from 1913, let's see if I can do this just simply, the East Dining Hall, which is now part of the William Johnson Building, which originally contained all the campus food service operations, including a bakery, a creamery, and a cannery. All that was built by Edwards as the first phase of Johnson Hall. The eastern part of the dining hall complex, called the Sewanee Arcade, provides informal dining under vaulted timber arched ceilings that recall the great halls of English universities and medieval country houses. The western portion of the building was a 1939 project of the Federal Emergency Administration of the Public Works under the New Deal, designed by Rudolph Weaver, who, as we noted, succeeded Edwards in 25 as architect for the Florida Board of Control. In 2011, this building was renovated. The 39 building was renovated with a new, that wing by Gould Evans Associates and a consultant from H2 Engineering, preserving the traditional collegiate Gothic exterior, but modernizing the interior, including the creation of a dramatic 5-story atrium. Undergraduate studies in the Department of Interior Architecture and Design, Art History, and Art Education, and other programs are now housed in this building. The 2 formal dining rooms on the second floor were converted to lecture halls. You can see one of them would have been under that vault for dining, but is now a lecture hall. Although some interior finishes were retained, wood ceiling beams and hand-painted cork ceiling tiles depicting sparrows, butterflies, herons, and waves, all part of the ornament that's original. And above the west front door, the cast-down stone sculpture of Demeter, the Greek goddess of plenty, remains on the building. Collegiate Gothic style. The style that Edwards inaugurated in 1907 for the Women's College continued for 4 decades until and including Hawthorne Hall, built in 46 after Edwards' death. Many of the college's historic residence halls aligned open green spaces, recalling English university quadrangles, and others were connected to the dining hall building by arcades. And although Edwards' brick construction and crenellation and buttresses and oriel windows and entry frontispieces and various pointed arches provide a stylistic unity to the college's historic campus, this is a characteristic which is recognized now, but what they call legacy walk on campus. Indeed, Edwards' 1923 Dodd Hall was described by Florida State University as, quote, a Gatsby-era icon, unquote, recognized in 2012 by the Florida chapter of the AIA as the 10th most popular building in the entire state of Florida. This is the library space, and it is a splendid interior, which we'll see there as the library. There were something like 2.4 million votes that were cast to determine that criteria. I think a lot of them were alumni. Dodd Hall was the original library for the Women's College, and the reading room, crowned by a hammer beam truss, ornamented with contemporary stained glass, now serves as the university's heritage museum, displaying photographs and ephemera and artifacts that document the history of FSU. And Edwards' design for Westcott Hall, 1910 to 1911, remains the Women's College's centerpiece. Although his buildings along Convocation Way include Jenny Murphy Hall and Reynolds Hall and Bryan Hall from various dates, they convey a coherent ensemble of collegiate Gothic style. It's the symmetry and the picturesque Westcott Hall, sited on a hill at the end of College Avenue, that provides the focal point of William Edwards' Florida State College for Women and the main overall design. It occupies a site that was once the location of an institute of higher education longer than any other site in Florida. Only 12 years after Florida achieved statehood, that was in 1845, West Florida Seminary, founded in 1851, began operations in 57. Its name was changed in 63 to the Florida Military Collegiate Institute, and by the 1890s, post-secondary education became the Institute's focus. And by 1897, the Institute had evolved to become Florida's first liberal arts college, renamed the Florida State College in 1901. 4 years later, the state's 6 institutes of higher learning were consolidated to become 2, with the men's school moving to Gainesville and the women's remaining in Tallahassee at the then-named Florida Female College. During that same year, 1905, William Edwards was named architect for the Florida Board of Control and began designing the buildings for the University of Florida. In 1909, the Women's Institute in Tallahassee was renamed the Florida State College for Women, and the old College Hall that looked like that originally and had served as the earlier institute was replaced by Westcott Hall, the William Edwards building. Now, this whole question of collegiate Gothic has a number of various kind of manifestations. It takes forms ranging from Ruskin-inspired polychrome brickwork, such as the work of Charles Babcock at Cornell, which we talked about several lectures ago and talking about Ruskinian architecture. That's Sage Hall and Sage Chapel above, all the way forward to the predominantly red brick neo-medieval architecture illustrated in Harold Bush Brown's buildings at Georgia Tech from 25 to 48. And ultimately, it moves to the predominantly Gothic Revival stone buildings, as seen in Jules Abel's West Campus and Chapel at Duke, or illustrated by Ralph Adam Cram's Graduate College and Chapel at Princeton. But there's even yet another variation of the theme, and with a different stylistic name, and that is what is sometimes called the Jacobean. It's halfway between Jacobean and Elizabethan, and so it is called Jacobean. And Marcus Whiffen, who's written a book defining American styles of architecture, distinguishes this and illustrates it with what's on the left screen, which is the dormitory complex at the University of Pennsylvania. This is by Cope and Stewartson and is an upper quadrangle. There are 39 conjoined residential halls built in 1895 at the University of Pennsylvania. and a little bit later, but not much, they went to St. Louis, same firm, and built Brookings Hall, 1900 to 1902 at Washington University in St. Louis, again illustrating the Jacobean, notably displaying the kind of Tudor gateway as a frontispiece to the quadrangles in the same way that Tudor gates are in evidence at Oxford and Cambridge in England. This is Trinity College, Oxford, to illustrate that compared to the University of Pennsylvania's Tudor gateway, and certainly Brookings Hall at Wash U reflects the same thing. So who knows? Maybe William Edwards was aware of Cope Stewartson's recently designed and built Jacobean work at these various places. But we go back to Westcott Hall, and there it is again. The Tudor Gateway, the sort of reference to Oxford and Cambridge, at Westcott Hall in 1910, and soon thereafter at his Withers building, which is what's on, Westcott is on the left and Withers on the right, at Winthrop College in Rock Hill, South Carolina. As likely a source for Edwards' borrowing, however, were the Jacobean public schools designed, interestingly enough, in St. Louis by an architect who was a major national figure in school design, a man named William B. Ittner. He was the commissioner of schools, just to give you a flavor of those in St. Louis. He was commissioner of schools responsible for the buildings for the Board of Education of St. Louis. Ittner designed over 50 schools in St. Louis alone, and his schools became widely known due to his authoring articles on school design in which his schools were regularly illustrated in architecture magazines of the day. So Ittner is credited with over 430 schools nationwide that either were built by him or, influenced by some design he had in an architecture magazine. I remember when I was looking at really early Principia buildings on their very first campus in St. Louis, the archivist looked and said, "Who is this William Bittner?" And I said, "No, it's not William Bittner, it's William B. Ittner." And he's the prominent architect for school design. His schools avoided the rectangular box. He created E plans, U plans, and H plans, all shaped floor plans. Corridors were lined up along large and grouped windows, allowing sunlight and ventilation to fill interior spaces. Most of all, he treated his exterior forms with style, designing schools as civic monuments for the city, incorporating towers, cupolas, and ornamental richness concentrated at grand entries and along varied skylines. In St. Louis, his 1901 Wyman School, his 1902 Yetman, renamed Central High School, his 1906 Clark School, and nearby 1908 Soldan High School. I knew these schools because I grew up right around the corner from Soldan on Union Boulevard in St. Louis, and Cleveland High School. Here's another view of Cleveland. From 1912, these all feature these Jacobean details, with the first four predating Edwards' Westcott and later contemporary with Withers by Edwards. So you see Cleveland on the top left, you see Withers below it, and you see Cleveland on the top right, and then Westcott down below that. And so they're really sister designs in a lot of ways. So 100 years later, St. Louis Landmarks has identified preserved in St. Louis 48 Ittner schools, still standing and still used. No, not still used by the Board of Education, but converted in some cases to housing and a variety of things. And the architects nationwide noticed, and I think Edwards was among them to notice. So here we are. At Florida State College for Women, a broad set of stairs leads to Westcott's Jacobean arched portal entry, above which rises a brick Tudor gateway with its stone trim, its crenellated corner polygonal turrets, and its three grouped 6/9 windows at two levels, separated by three relief panels. And perhaps the panels were intended to be inscribed, they never were executed, with the college's motto of Vires Artis and Mores, referencing Latin to signify strength, skill, and character. But they never carved it on there. I'm just thinking that maybe that's what they ought to carve it on there. The Great Portal served both as an entry to the administration building as well as a campus gateway, closing the vista at the end of College Avenue beyond the fountain, which is around which so many FSU traditions have played out over the years. And by the time Westcott Hall was built, Edwards and Walker had already moved their architectural offices to Atlanta, where they were building the still extant, and this is not one of their most glorious buildings, but it's still there on Juniper, the Sumner apartment building from 1909, just about the year they arrive here in Atlanta. It's number 754 to 62 Juniper. And it's surrounded by buildings which give me an impression this isn't going to be there very long. It's designed in the tradition of garden apartments, 3-story buildings enclosing a small garden in a U-plan open to the street. There were a number of these built all the way through Atlanta. The brick wall, ornamented with a pattern of pierced cross openings and brick piers flanking the entry walk, closed the space from the street with a recessed metal gate for privacy. The whole is constructed in tan brick with the apartment block's 3 wings capped by shallow hipped roofs with bracketed overhanging wood eaves. And with the extensive redevelopment underway along Juniper Street, it's possible the apartment block's days are numbered. But also, early on, when they first arrived here in Atlanta, Edwards and Walker designed the English Avenue School in 1910, completed in 1911. The Atlanta firm of Daniel and Boutel designed the additions in 1923, and both the original building and its 1923 wings feature brick construction in the unusual pattern of 5 courses of running bond between single courses of alternating headers and stretchers. You often see it with a row of headers, but to have a header stretcher every 6th row is unusual. Other notable features include the limestone trim, coins, surrounds, and segmental arches, the raked and crenellated parapets, window mold, etc. The commission came to Edwards and Walker at an important time in the development of educational facilities in Atlanta and was one of the largest public elementary facilities constructed by the public school system at the time. By 1920, the city's rapid increase in population and consequent growth in student population, they estimated that the student population of Atlanta grew during those years from 2,090 to 41,337. And that prompted an expansion in the number of public schools in the Atlanta system from 3 to 73. At the time of Daniel and Boutel's expansion of the English Avenue School, architect A. Ten Eyck Brown was working throughout the city with Atlanta's most prominent architects, building public schools on standardized plans, but with distinctive styling from Byzantine to Neo-Romanesque to Georgian neoclassical. And William Edwards, then partnered with William Sayward, was assigned to build Girls High School in that building campaign in Grant Park, and we'll discuss that actually next time. But as Edwards and Walker's English Avenue School was completed in 1911, Edwards' partner, Frank Walker, broke from the firm, eventually, as noted, practicing in Tulsa for 30 years, from 1917 to 47. So William Edwards is now on his own, and his next project is extremely interesting. Oops, if it doesn't go back too far. And that is falls in that brief period between the end of his partnership with Walker and his new partnership with William Sayward. Both the Oddfellows building and the auditorium attached to it at its west end have dated inscriptions on the buildings, 1912 and 1913 respectively. The District Grand Lodge number 18, Grand United Order of the Oddfellows building, was likely designed in 1911, and the Royal Theater of the auditorium annexed the following year. It's in Sweet Auburn. It's right on Auburn Avenue. It continues, of course, the Jacobean spirit of Edwards's collegiate buildings with its rich interplay of brick walls, terracotta ornamental moldings, stone base, and trim. and observers are rewarded with details throughout the building's tripartite elevation. Dutch bond brickwork, which creates these large diamond patterns in the headers, enriching the building's crown. Recessed spandrels with terracotta inserts so that the four middle floors read as grouped under shallow arcade between brick pilasters. Carved heads flanking arched entries, and again positioned higher up in the elevation, peering down at the sidewalk as though monitoring who's going to enter the building. Corner end bays enriched with foliate spandrels between windows and capped with elaborate terracotta trim so that the corner bays read as towers. The entry arch and window trim of the auditorium's central bay recalls the rich surface pattern of the Flemish canal warehouses and townhouses in Brugge, while the upper gable displays a rich shield panel with a manner inscribed GUO of OF, Grand United Order of the Oddfellows. The shield and banner interlaced with the garland and leafage. Well, during the years immediately following the departure of Walter, Edwards juggled a large number of projects throughout the Southeast. Collegiate projects in Florida included Floyd Hall in 1912, Anderson and Peterson Hall at Gainesville in 1913, Reynolds Hall and the Sewanee Dining Hall at the Women's College in 1913. Several of his courthouses date from this period. The one at Tift, Georgia is 12 to 13. The one in Calhoun, South Carolina is 1913. The one in Hernando, Florida is 1913, and the one in Florida at Sumter is 1912 to 14. In 1914, he also completed the City Hall and Firehouse at Bainbridge, Georgia, an L-shaped corner building in brick with Mission Revival wall dormers on 2 elevations and a tower in the inner elbow. Since 2007, this building has served as the Firehouse Arts Center and Gallery in Bainbridge, so it's at an adaptive reuse. Now, with all these commissions following the departure of Walter, Edwards may well have sought additional assistance. He soon found the professional collaboration with whom he is best known, William J. Sayward. Arriving in Atlanta from Seattle around 1912 to 13, when all these buildings are piling into the office, Sayward joins Edwards as the latter's third and most long-lasting and most productive partner. But before addressing the work of Edwards and Sayward, one can briefly review Edwards' other public work before 1915, particularly as county courthouses. County courthouses, I don't know why this wants to skip ahead twice. County courthouses of the late 19th century in the Southeast were frequently towered structures, styled in Romanesque forms, more frequently constructed in brick than in the weighty rusticated stone of Richardson's model of the Allegheny County Courthouse, for instance, in Pittsburgh, which is an 1883 project and was influential in a lot of courthouses. But early Bruce and Morgan towered courthouses, and including actually their towered school buildings like Agnes Scott's administration building, Tech Tower, Clemson's Tillman Tower. They build these towered Romanesque buildings, but a lot of it is based on some of those courthouse projects, and ultimately, arguably, go back to Richardson. At Winthrop College, Edwards Withers building of 1912 to 13 was built right across the street from Bruce and Morgan's 1894 Tillman Hall, which was the original main building on the Rock Hill, South Carolina campus. But by the first decade of the new century, the new classical taste was in evidence for public buildings, in part influenced by the classicism of the Columbian World's Exposition in Chicago in 1893, but also reinforced by the Beaux-Arts influenced architectural programs in emerging architectural schools from MIT, which was established in 1865, very early, University of Illinois, which had its architecture program from 1867, and Georgia Tech, which was established its architecture program in 1908. And many American architects had traveled to Paris to study at the École des Beaux-Arts and had been taught by professors who had done so. And so in South Carolina, William Edwards began designing county courthouses in 1903 when his Darlington courthouse was built, and many of these are in a classical style. and I'll just show you a number of them because I'm going to have to just kind of skip through them fairly quickly. These are the one at Kershaw, which doesn't still survive, although the one at Sumter is sort of a variant on that theme, does survive from 1907. And after the Kershaw Commission, he builds in 1907 Sumter County. The following year, that in Abbeville, South Carolina, where the courthouse is right next door to the Opera House, which are both by Edwards and are still extant, two very interesting buildings right on the county courthouse. In the same year as the Abbeville pair, he designs the Lee County Courthouse, his fifth in the state of South Carolina in as many years, and part of a geographic cluster of Edwards courthouses, inasmuch as Lee County was formed in 1902 as part of Darlington, Kershaw, and Sumter counties, where he had individual courthouses for all three of those. Then they merged and became Lee, and so he builds a new one for Lee. The Dillon County Courthouse from 1911 on the right, which I'm comparing due to the similarity in terms of both of them using recessed loges against the masonry building. That was dates to 1911, the year Edwards' partner Frank Walter left the practice to follow an independent path in architecture. And his departure could not have happened at a busier time. Edwards and Walters had just completed their McMaster's School in Columbia, one of 16 schools following the standardized guidelines that he established and were established by the state legislature in 1904, at the time that 1905, at the time Edwards was named as head of the Board of Control. And after the Dillon Courthouse Commission, Edwards received 6 more commissions for courthouses during the early 19-teens. In Tiff, Georgia in 1912, in Calhoun, South Carolina in 1913, in Hernando, Florida in 1913, in Sumter, Florida in 1914, York, South Carolina in 1914, and Jasper, South Carolina in 1915. It began to appear like he was taking a few shortcuts in repeating variations on previous used formulas, either the porticoed courthouse or the loggia courthouse, and so some of them were done in tan brick and then translated into red brick, etc. But he's got so many buildings coming into the firm that it becomes really problematic. Here you can see 2 of them that are sort of cousins. The one in Hernando, Florida from 1913 it seems to me clearly based on the one in Dillon from 2 years earlier. They're both by Edwards, but he's getting commissioned so quickly he's not giving them new designs sometimes. And here's another pair of examples. York in 1914 and Jasper, both in South Carolina from 1915, both with tetrastyle Ionic porticos, the temple fronts with Ionic order from the 2. During the same hectic post-Walter years, Edwards's extensive work at the University of Florida and Florida A&M continued, and with medieval-inspired collegiate work, classical revival courthouses, even a mission revival courthouse, which you see here. The architect appeared to be juggling an eclectic variety of design ideas and styles, but he needed help. And so William J. Sayward provides that help in what became a highly effective partnership lasting more than a quarter of a century. Sayward joined Edwards in his Atlanta office in 1912, and soon after you start seeing a slew of Edwards and Sayward buildings, which is the more famous and best known of the firm. Of course, we continue this overview that we started several weeks ago of the predominantly educational architecture of William Augustus Edwards. Surveyed in our previous session from the early years when he was mainly operating out of South Carolina with 2 partners, Charles Coker Wilson first, and then Frank C. Walter until about 1913. And then he joins William and Sayward, and and he's settled in Atlanta around 1915. So when you think of William Augustus Edwards, most everybody thinks of Edwards and Sayward. I mean, that is the firm that most people think of, and that's what part two is all about, is the activity of Edwards and Sayward, mostly here in Atlanta. Of course, we looked at the extensive work as an established school architect, and he is one of the great school architects. He worked at the University of Florida, University of Florida A&M, and other educational institutions in Florida and in South Carolina. And then he did a whole slew, if any of you were here last time, of county courthouses in the same state as well as in Georgia. And then prior to joining Edwards, William Sayward had spent 6 years with McKim, Mead, and White in New York, and then partnered with a W.R.B. Wilcox in Vermont, where that early partnership of Sayward and Wilcox, this is before he even comes to Atlanta, produced something like 100 buildings up in New England. He then was attracted to opportunities on the West Coast, and the firm of Wilcox and Sayward moved to their whole office to Seattle in 1907, and although Sayward left the practice and returned east in 5 years after that, in 1912, it was a sign of his value to the firm that Wilcox kept his name on the practice until 1915. By that date, of course, Sayward and William Edwards had confirmed Atlanta as their home base, and were establishing a new partnership. This is going to be ultra sensitive again, so hold on. There we go. In 1915, even as his women's gymnasium for the University of Florida, which is now called Ulster Hall, was continuing to engage him in work in Florida, he was a state architect for schools in Florida. He confirmed that his practice was going to be Atlanta-based. That confirmation was, as most often is the case, I'll get this right in a minute. Come on, what is it doing? That's what I need to do. This is his house on 10th Street, which overlooks Piedmont Park and is now part of the children's school that's surviving from his move to Atlanta. And he started a new architectural practice, began to busy itself with the design and construction in Atlanta of what was his first major project, a project you're all very familiar with, Lakewood Fairgrounds. Designed in 1915 to 1916 and erected for the Southeastern Fair. Now, the fairgrounds was envisioned as early as 1910, intended to compete with the Macon Agricultural Fair. The intended site of Lakewood was originally the location of the city waterworks, and in 1894 there was a large amusement park there. For the design of the new fairgrounds buildings and grounds, the Georgia chapter of the AIA sponsored an inter-chapter competition with the competitors serving as the jury. And Edwards and Sayward's proposal was selected, then further developed with selected architects conferring with a chapter-appointed committee. Francis Palmer Smith, who was head of the architecture school at Georgia Tech, executed this extraordinary rendering that you're looking at on the screen, an elegant bird's eye view rendering of the final project, which was published in the Atlanta newspaper, and a drawing that is now displayed in the architecture building at Georgia Tech. The first Southeastern Fair featured livestock, agriculture, an automobile show, fireworks, a suffragette demonstration, horse racing on a 4-mile track around the lake, and their exhibition buildings, by which they became somewhat noted with this regional style, these were styled in the Mission Revival forms, borrowing their towers from the Santa Barbara Mission in California, while also adopting the mission's west front oculus opening in an enlarged and elaborated form. No doubt this interest in Spanish colonial forms was inspired by the California fairs, these expositions that were held in San Francisco and San Diego the previous year in 1915. One was called the Panama Pacific Exposition, the other one the Panama California Exposition, and they were celebrating the opening of the Panama Canal. But they adopted in 1915 Spanish forms and ornament as a regional expression for California, and Edwards and Sayward found the architectural language comparably appropriate for the southeastern region, adapting it for the fairgrounds buildings in 1916, and again the very next year at West Hall on the campus of South Georgia State Normal College. That is now Valdosta State University. At the Spanish Colonial West Hall in Valdosta, the shallow dome and lantern were likely inspired by a similar centerpiece at the exotic Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine that dates from 1888, now Flagler College, and that in turn influenced the California building that was built at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. You can see the Chicago World's Fair in the center, the Ponce de Leon on the right side, and then West Hall down in Valdosta on the other two images. Now these two were fresh in my mind because my major work was on the architect Bernard Maybeck, and when Maybeck came out of Paris and was entering the École des Beaux-Arts, finished with the École des Beaux-Arts, came back to the States, he needed a job, and his friend, maybe even roommate, but certainly his friend at the École was Hastings of Carrere and Hastings. Carrere and Hastings had just formed their partnership. This was the first building they ever built, and they needed draftsmen, so they hired Maybeck. So I became aware of the Ponce de Leon Hotel years ago because of my study of Maybeck. And then Maybeck goes out to California, still needs a job. He goes to the office of A. Page Brown, an established California firm in San Francisco, and Brown is designing the California building, which I suspect Maybeck had a major hand in doing, because he got a job being a draftsman for A. Page Brown just as this building was being built. So these domes pop from the Ponce de Leon to the California building in Chicago to Valdosta by Edwards. And at South Georgia State Normal College, West Hall became the catalyst and model for repeated usage and it's been torn down recently, but repeated usages of Spanish stucco surfaces, red tile roofs, arcades, buttresses, walls extending above the roof eaves, and capped with curvilinear and step profiles, and all kinds of recessed accents, ocula and the like. The Spanish colonial features evidenced throughout the campus, even as late as 2009 in the Student Health Center built at Valdosta. South Georgia State Normal College, 1913 to 1922, was renamed the Georgia State Women's College in 1922, and then it became Valdosta State College in 1950, and it achieved university status under the current name of Valdosta State University in 1993. Now, similar name changes and gender affiliation shifts took place in Florida. By 1933, the Florida State College for Women in Tallahassee had become the third largest women's college in the country. As architect for the Florida State Board of Control, William Edwards had designed the school's earlier buildings, including Bryan Hall in 1907, the administrator, we saw some of these last time, Westcott Hall, 1911, Reynolds and Swanee Dining Hall, 1913, Broward in 1917, Francis Eapes in 1918, the Infirmary in 1919. It's a long list of buildings there at Tallahassee. And then the Murphy Hall and Diffenbaugh buildings, both from 1921, and finally Dodd Hall in 1924. He was stepped down as being state architect for Florida in 1925, and Rudolph Weaver took over, and then he continues to build a whole nother slew of buildings at the university, all serving the college while it was still a women's school. And after one of the last ones was Cawthorne Hall, built in 1946, right after World War II. It was built in 46 to 48, but it's a Weaver design. Even though he died in 44, he had finished the design, and they built it after his death. It was the last Gothic Revival building on the campus, and a campus essentially the product for 4 decades of design by just 2 architects over the whole 4 decades, Edwards and Weaver. They had headed the Florida Board of Control from the date of its creation in 1905 all the way till 1944. Now, moreover, other changes were imminent at Florida Women's College. After World War II, a large number of male soldiers returned to Florida from overseas to complete their education, seeking to take advantage of the new GI Bill and to which would underwrite their degrees. In 1947, the Florida State College for Women became coeducational, as did the University of Florida, which up to that point had been for all men. And the Women's College in Tallahassee was renamed Florida State University. Edwards' tenure with the Florida Board of Control ended in 1925, but he continued to design educational buildings throughout the 20s and the 30s, all the way up until his death in 1939. And some of the later buildings that we can look at from that second phase include the Caroline Brevard Grammar School from 1925, the Sealing Memorial Elementary School, which we'll look at in a moment, both of these in Tallahassee. Also the building of the Columbia Theological Seminary right around the corner from here in Decatur, beginning with Campbell Hall from 1926. He built Tallapoosie Hall in at the Lyman Ward Military Academy in Alabama, and then at Agnes Scott, Buttrick Hall and the McCain Library, both of them are Edwards and Sayward buildings here at Agnes Scott. His latest known courthouse design, the Temple-fronted courthouse for Fannin County, Georgia, dates from 1937, is now a mountain center for the arts, but all of these are dating from this last period up to the time of his death. This structure, which you're looking at on the screen now, the Carolina Brevard Grammar School in Tallahassee, was funded by a $150,000 allocation for a new K-6 school to serve white children during an era when schools for blacks in the county were mostly one-room rural buildings. When public kindergartens were established, the Brevard Grammar School dropped the kindergarten level in 1941, closed altogether in 1959 when changing demographics and city population shifts to the northeast encouraged the sale of the building to the state for office buildings. It was originally designed in a kind of Mediterranean style with stucco surfaces, red tile roof, terracotta accents. The 1925 school features a notable pedimented frontispiece with pierced oculus, an open 131 arcading, corbelline, varied column capitals, and a dramatic semicircular Voysey-esque overdoor hood supported by brackets and columns. And I know one in the audience knows exactly what I mean by the Voysey hood on that front door. When the State Road Department vacated the building in December 1964, the Board of Commissioners of State Institutions of the state of Florida paid more than $2 million for the edifice that was 14 times what it cost to build it 40 years earlier. The name was changed to the Bloxham Building after Florida's Governor William Bloxham, who served from 1881 to 85 and again from 1897 to 1901. And this remains in Tallahassee. It's still there, and it's the oldest school building in the city. The Sealy Memorial Elementary building, which I'm including partly because of Girls High, which we'll look at in a moment in Grant Park, but this is also in Tallahassee, dates from 29 to 30. It was styled more in the tradition of some of the schools we looked at last time by William B. Ittner of St. Louis, who was a major national school architect. Windows are grouped and arched on the ground floor. Ornaments was concentrated on the face of a crossed axial gable frontispiece, whose wider central bay contains the school's entry, with an arched tympanum above and flanking windows topped with inset decorative grille panels. The second level of the arcading echoes the arcading of a Romanesque church, something like Modena in Italy, or even some of the triple windows of Peterborough in its clear story, or Ely on the south arm of its western transept. All of these are kind of recombined and show some inspiration, but enriched with a kind of polychrome that's evidenced in French Aquitaine Romanesque, such as at Notre Dame Le Puy, the cathedral we saw on the right and the bottom color view. Polychromed corbelline along the eaves restates the patterning of voussoirs, decorative insets, contrasting window trim, and polychromed lintel and jambs at the entry to transform a masonry school building into a civic monument. That is exactly what Ittner was calling for across the country. Make these public school buildings monuments to the city. And there certainly is that character. It was also the custom of architects in Edwards' day to refer to books in their professional libraries and to maintain scrapbooks of admired buildings, both serving as source material for their history-influenced designs. And of course, that brings us to Girls High in Atlanta. Edwards and Sayward's Girls High School was comparably historicist in style and is a highly decorated civic monument, might be said to be even more in the Ittner tradition than pretty much any of the schools in the city. It followed A. Ike Brown's prescription of required components, including double-loaded corridors, classroom dimensions which were prescribed, large windows for ventilation and daylighting, an auditorium for school-wide meetings, a gymnasium for exercise, although the latter two were not end appendages as they often were in these 1920s schools under Brown's general supervision. The school was remarkable in several ways. And there's a little bit of a background to these early 1920s schools in Atlanta, which some of you may know, but I'm going to repeat in case you don't. When the Atlanta public school system was inaugurated in 1872, there were 7 schools established: a girls' high, a boys' high, and 5 elementary schools. For 50 years, Girls High operated out of the John Neal William Lyon residence, a mansion that served as General William Sherman's headquarters during the occupation of Atlanta by Union troops, and which stood on the present site of Atlanta's City Hall. The size of the facility grew as student population increases, and new schools throughout Atlanta were added as enrollment pressures increased. By 1896, there were a grand total of 22 schools in Atlanta, 15 grammar schools for white children, 5 grammar schools for black students, and 2 high schools for white students, Boys High and Girls High. By 1920, the student population had grown to 41,337, and these were now served by 73 school buildings, some offering merely 4 classrooms, and with 10 schools forced to erect, if this sounds familiar, 10 portable frame buildings of 2 rooms each to supplement their already meager facility. 2 national leaders in education, George Drayton Strayer and Nicholas Lewis Englehart, were brought to Atlanta to survey the city's public school system for the school year 1921 to 1922. Strayer was the head of the department and professor of educational administration at Teachers College at Columbia University. And Englehart would later author a book entitled Planning Secondary School Buildings, which was published in New York by Reinhardt. They completed a similar report earlier for Binghamton School System in 1919, for Hackensack, New Jersey, published in June of 1921, and so they were absolutely the national experts on telling Atlanta what they should learn about their school system. And the report card stunk. For Atlanta, the Strayer-Englehart report, as it came to be known, analyzed the organization, the administration, and the finances of the school system, and with respect to the architecture of schools, addressed such issues as site analysis, building structure reports, service systems, classroom layout, and any specialty rooms like for music or art or whatever that may or may not exist. Strayer and Englehart developed a complex scoring system and applied it to each Atlanta school. A hierarchy of urgent needs established 4 groups of schools with recommendations for each school. And the Englehart report was described as a severe and in some areas devastating criticism of the existing Atlanta school system, pointing out the unsanitary, unsafe, dilapidated nature of most of the school buildings. Many of the early city schools were wood-framed structures with no fire escapes. It was a dismal report card assessing the city's outdated public schools. And as that academic year under study approached its end, the city passed a massive $8,850,000 bond issue, of which half was to go to school buildings, $4,000 earmarked for schools, and it passed in March of 1921. That brings us to A. Ike Brown as the supervisor of a whole group of really the finest school buildings in this city. He was appointed, A. Ike Brown was appointed supervising architect for the new schools to be built with the funds that were being made available from the bond issue. He established cost-effective standardized features with respect to mechanical and service and structural elements of the buildings to be built or remodeled throughout the city, and most schools featured double-loaded corridors, standardized typical classroom size, provision of space for specialty classes, for laboratories, for cafeterias, for auditorium, gymnasium. All of these latter functions often, or several of them came a bit later. Before bids were solicited, Brown articulated specifications for plumbing and heating and electrical wiring, what materials would be used for stairway design, for toilet details. I mean, he was the supervising architect over the whole slew of some of these best buildings. And here they are all, not all of them, but here are some of the better ones. He selected a different Atlanta architect to design each of the major schools under his supervision, including Francis Palmer Smith, who designed Joseph Brown Junior High School. P. Thornton Marie, the firm built the Fox Theater later in the decade to build O'Keefe Junior High. Eugene Wachendorf, who built Crawford Long to build Booker T. Washington High School. Morgan and Dillon, who built Bruce and Morgan built Agnes Scott's administration building, Tech Tower, Clemson, all of them to build William A. Bass High School in Inman Park. Philip Schutzey to build Boys High, which is now called Midtown, and G. Lloyd Preacher and Edwards and Sayward, of course, to build Girls High, a new Girls High. G. Lloyd Preacher, who built City Hall in 1930, was active in the building of elementary schools. Most of these others that I've told you are showing here are high schools. Each building was constructed in brick. Many displayed rich patterns of terracotta ornament, corbelling, and a generally neo-Romanesque styling. One, of course, that stands out a little from that tradition is Boys High, by virtue of Schutzey's classical styling, looking to the Italian Renaissance and to the architect Alberti for inspiration, while Edwards and Sayward's Girl High displays the most direct historicism in its Byzantine dome and its main entry, borrowing directly from 12th century porch design. There's the dome looking at a bunch of other Byzantine domes. It's sort of hard to wonder which one of those is Girls High. Well, the one on the far right, I guess, from your, and the front door, the same kind of borrowing. This is from the west front of the Basilica of San Zeno in Verona, Italy, in the north of Italy. The brickwork of Edwards and Sayward's Girl High was enriched by Flemish bond. That usually blackens the headers, but he blackened some of the stretchers to give it even more of a variegated surface patterning. Terracotta inserts, concrete belt courses and windowsills, elaborate corbelling, contrasting voussoirs and keystones, all of that adding to the richness of the detailing. And like San Zeno, the school features a 12-petaled rose window in its gabled frontispiece. Obviously, proportions changing in the two buildings. Inside Girls High, there were 104 rooms, including 20 classrooms and individual offices for 39 teachers. Individual offices for the teachers. Oh, how enlightened that is. Specialized science halls, laboratories, a music room, an art department, and a library with locker alcoves and 2 study halls opposite. Addressing the additional needs for the female student population and future homemakers, there was a model apartment containing a living room and dining room, a bedroom, a bath, and kitchenette. And the school's business department provided a school bank cage to encourage the girls to save while they were involved in and to learn something of the banking business while they were at the school. Now, in William Edwards' earlier Davis Hall in Limehouse University, I guess I don't have a view of that. I thought I put that in. No, I don't. I'll leave that on for the moment. There was a central tower and a dome capping three-story rotunda space. At Girls High, however, the dome is shallow and more of a roof detail than a structural or spatial feature. But there is space under the dome on the third floor for an assembly room that seats 400. And the remaining third floor is set back in order to provide rooftop terracing for outdoor classes. That's something that became very popular in early modern architecture, mid-century modern, but here it is at Girls High in the 1920s. And the floor is the second-story roof. The Edwards and Sayward School opened in January of 1925 and continued to operate as Girls High until 1947, when Atlanta public high schools became coeducational. And Girls High was renamed at that time Roosevelt High in honor of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had died in April of 45, and of course whose New Deal agency would continue to assist in other additions to this building. The Works Progress Administration, for instance, was active between 1935 and 1943, and it helped to fund Edwards and Sayward's boiler house and cafeteria addition to Girls High in 1937.
Where is that? Is that still in the street? Grant Park?
It's in Grant Park. The building's still there.
It's surrounded by trees. Right. I guess that's it's lost. We need to liberate it.
And of course, following the conversion of the high school as a coeducational school, the successor firm of Sayward, Logan, and Williams then added the gymnasium, which is, you see, it's at the far end of the right view, but it's at the close view on the left. It was there for the physical education department and the military departments. And in 1953, architect R. Keenan Perry added a new cafeteria and a kitchen. In 1965, Miller and Elaine renovated the science lab and classrooms, and the school continued its public education role in Grant Park until 1985, when Roosevelt was combined with Hoke Smith Technical School to create a new school building on a site on Glenwood Avenue behind Girls High. It's down the hill and just on the back side. The following year, architects Serber and Barber began to convert Girls High, the original Girls High, to a group of apartments named the Roosevelt. And in 1995, the same firm converted the gymnasium to loft apartments, receiving an Urban Design Award for both projects. Now, while Girls High evidences the maturity of William Edwards as a school designer, the contemporary Masonic Lodge, which is right across the street from us here, the Pythagoras Lodge number 41, free and accepted Masons from 24 to 25, was designed by Sayward alone. He was a member of the lodge. It's styled in full-blown Beaux-Arts classicism. The Masonic building displays a giant order of paired Ionic columns, a rusticated stone base, strict symmetry, and an aggrandized entryway. The first floor accommodated commercial use, historically a bank. The second floor contained offices and a grand staircase to the third floor, where the Masons had their meeting room under a deep coffered ceiling and a relatively plain interior space. The focal point of the meeting room is a speaker's platform backed by a simple arch with keystone and flanked by massive fluted Doric columns. Otherwise, there is no wall ornamentation or decorative painting, which a lot of Masonic lodges inside are pretty elaborate in their ornamentation. It was constructed of tan brick with limestone base, columns, and entablature. The building features a main facade of 5 bays, whose center 3 are recessed behind 2 pairs of colossal unfluted Ionic columns with a single colossal column at each end of the recess. The entablature steps forward at the end bays, where coining replicates ground floor rustication. The design is a variation on the theme of Edwards' loggia courthouses designs, although here displayed in a masterful way the kind of manipulations and exaggerations of classical elements that is almost characteristically Mannerist, a la 16th century Italy. On the upper level of the corner bays, an enriched single balconied window is flanked by banded pilasters and capped by a strong keystone and single voussoirs reaching up into the window pediment, a Mannerist manipulation of classicism that recalls some of the manipulations of Romano's Palazzo del Te and Mantua. The main entry is equally rich and grandiloquent. The opening is arched with flanking banded columns and stone rusticated wall surfaces delineated with deep mortar joints. The whole thing takes on a Serlio character, whose banding and smooth rustication around the windows and doors was later adapted by James Gibbs in what became known as the Gibbs surround. Here Sayward caps the arched entry with a swan neck pediment open to a finial whose base is faced with a Masonic emblem. And above, the center bay displays a rich cartouche within the facade recess. In the end, the main street facade is ennobled by two-story columns and offers an urbane character and compatibility with the classical county courthouse opposite, in which we are now camping. Sayward was active in designing this building on his own while Edwards was busy with other things, presumably. He was also active in professional architectural organizations, as well as the Masonic movement. In 1917, he served as president of the Atlanta chapter of the American Institute of Architects. In 1918, he was as a member of the Georgia Legislative Committee on Architectural Registration. He helped craft guidelines for the registration of architects in Georgia, which were instituted the next year. In 1923, he was elected to the National Board of the AIA in Washington. And in 1926, he became a fellow of the AIA. So Edwards' third partner was no slouch. He was very active in many, many ways. And that same year that Edwards and Sayward were active in these buildings, Girls High and the like, he begins the work at Columbia Seminary in Decatur. The building began with the firm's Campbell Hall in 1926, which I'll show a small photograph first and point out in the perspective where that is. And of course, you can see what was envisioned as a much more elaborate campus that was intended to guide the seminary over future decades. Most of these drawings are listed as Edward and Sayward Architects Robert Logan Associate, and it's interesting that we'll get to see some Logan buildings in a moment as well. This surviving bird's eye perspective drawing shows Campbell Hall to the right of a monumental tower. The tower itself, I think, was probably inspired by Harkness Tower at Yale University by James Rogers from 4 years earlier. Ground was broken at Campbell Hall in September of 1926. The seminary's first building housed classrooms, a chapel on the second floor, the Theological Seminary's library, a dining room in the basement with very low ceiling, and administrative offices. In addition, some dormitory space for the all-male student population was nicknamed the Monastery, and it developed on the third floor under the roof of Campbell House in the early years. The 1926 bird's eye view shows additional connected collegiate Gothic blocks extending beyond the proposed tower to the left of Campbell, southeast along South Columbia Drive, then turning southwest where additional gable blocks aligned in open green. At the northwest end of Campbell Hall, the drawing projected a covered arcaded walk leading to a cruciform chapel with another larger cruciform building, likely the library, outside the campus green on its south flank. And yet another cruciform building was projected further southeast along the road frontage, a sanctuary you can see over here. I can't really point to it here, but on the far right corner, that was projected to be built. It was eventually built, but in an entirely different style and completely independent of Columbia seminary, it was built for Columbia Presbyterian Church and ultimately used quite frequently by the seminary. And it's a work of Bothwell and Nash, somewhat a la, I've got a small photograph of it, of what they actually built in the top right corner there. That's a project not of Edwards and Sayward, but a colonial revival by Bothwell and Nash. And Bothwell and Nash continued some of the work at Columbia Theological Seminary in the 1960s, building Florida Hall and the Student Center. Florida Hall is shown here in its built form and color. It was a dormitory for married students and contained 40 suites of 2 rooms connected by a bath with its 4th floor accommodating single students with a communal bath. Of significant historically, it also is association of William C. Pauley, the landscape architect who laid out the grounds. Now, Edwards and Sayward's tower at Campbell Hall was never built, nor were several other buildings the firm initially envisioned in the 1920s for the seminary. The tower end of Campbell, for instance, remained unfinished, not receiving its southeast wing until 1950. Indeed, by 1971, the campus only had 5 major buildings. However, among the Edwards and Sayward drawings is a bird's eye view and a typical floor plan for a proposed dormitory for married students, which is a very interesting building that would have been nice to have seen erected, although a variation of it was built as one of the other dormitories. The plan shows an organization of interior accommodations as suites, 6 sort of interlocked suites per floor, each with a large living room, bedroom, kitchenette, bath, and dressing room. The residence hall that Edwards and Sayward actually did build soon after Campbell Hall was a simpler building. It's known as a Simmons, or maybe Simon's Law Dormitory, dates from 1926 to 7, and the building continued in use for more than 80 years. And then in 2011 to 12, a LEED Gold certified project by Lord Ekin Sargent and New South Construction executed a major interior renovation to the building and additions to the dorm, including a modern bell tower, appended a new lecture hall and classroom wings to the earlier block, and therefore, by doing so, formed an open cloister off the cloister walk and an open terrace. It acts as a cloister in a way. The expanded building was renamed the Vernon Broyles Leadership Center. The campus work ceased during the Depression and the war years of the 1930s and early 40s, although it remained awkward that a theological seminary's chapel was in a small second-floor room in a classroom, library, administration building. The issue was to a degree finessed when the seminary donated 6.5 acres of its land in the 1940s to the independent congregation of Columbia Presbyterian Church, whose church, right on the edge of the seminary campus, was designed by Bothwell and Nash, and is borrowed by the seminary for large campus gatherings periodically anyway, so they sort of got the best of both worlds. In the 1950s, however, it brought new campus construction at the seminary. The first unit of a Mission Haven in 1950, a second unit soon followed, the Mathis Memorial Gateway from 1953, the John Bulow Library from 53 with its Gothic reading room. The library addition dates to 95 to 6, and 4 apartments in 1954 and 4 more in 56. A new student union was built from 59 to 62. We're now seeing a bit more watered down Gothicry in these buildings, dedicated as the Richards Center in 1962. It featured several lounges, a game room, bookstore, post office, classrooms, offices, and a main dining hall, which is effectively a refectory, in the old tradition of medieval refectories, but also the Oxford tradition in a sense, but also an assemblage room as well. Then there was another 25-year lull in construction until 1988, when the Harrington Center was built at the seminary, a gift from the Peachtree Presbyterian Church in honor of W. Frank Harrington, a graduate of Columbia and the Peachtree's senior pastor. The Harrington Center was then expanded by Warren Summers Bitzel Benefield Ward and Associates in 1999, and then finally comes along the Lord Ekin Sargent 2008-9 addition of to the Graduate Residence Hall with that superb tower, that kind of campanile bell tower that they've added as well. Now, contemporary with their early work for Columbia Seminary are several buildings designed by Edwards and Sayward for public parks in the city of Atlanta. At Piedmont Park, Edwards designed stone gates at the 10th Street and the 12th Street. The 12th Street ones are raised, and 14th Street entrances, as well as the Piedmont Park bathhouse from 1926 to 7. The latter was expanded in 2008 by Smith Dahlia to include a 9,000 square foot LEED gold events space known as Greystone. The master plan and landscape design at Greystone, and there you can see Greystone as an event space after it got expanded. Edwards and Sayward also designed the Piedmont Park Golf Clubhouse, which is now preserved within the larger structure of a restaurant at the corner of Monroe and 10th Street. The 1989-90 restaurant conversion was designed by Andrew Swartz and Aiken. And Aiken and Sheets with a clock tower referencing the 1895 clock tower that had been nearby at the Cotton States Exposition held in Piedmont Park a century earlier. All of these gates, golf clubhouses, park buildings were built in Stone Mountain granite, as were Edwards and Sayward's entry gates off McClendon into Candler Park, which you can see in the bottom right. Candler Park's 55 acres of parkland was donated to the city in 1922 by Coca-Cola founder Asa Candler with the stipulation that the land only be used for city park purposes. That very specific fact saved us from the Presidential Parkway that was going to go right through Druid Hills in more recent times. Candler hired landscape architect Helen Smith to design a 9-hole golf course on the donated land so his daughter could play golf. Lucy Beale Candler Owens, hence Leedy, she had multiple marriages, because the nearby Druid Hills golf course prohibited women from playing on the nearby course. So Daddy built her a golf course in Candler Park. Both father Asa and daughter Lucy lived in Druid Hills, but only Asa and other males could use the Druid Hills golf course. The gender-neutral Candler Park golf course opened in 1927, and its unadorned clubhouse, another park building by Edwards and Sayward, but this time constructed of brick, appeared the following year. And the firm's final golf course was built in 1941 for the Bobby Jones golf course in Atlanta. It was a WPA project for the course designed in 32 and named, of course, for Atlanta's most famous golfer. I don't know if I have another view of that. No, I don't. Okay. Private residential designs, almost nothing by the firm. They just were primarily public buildings and school buildings. It were almost unheard of or unknown, but with the exception of the 1927 Covington House in a subdivision of Tallahassee. The subdivision is called Los Robos, so it's going to have a Spanish character to the house. It was an automobile subdivision sited on 37 acres of farmland about a mile from downtown Tallahassee among aged oaks. That's what Los Robos in Spanish is for oaks. The farmhouse that stood among established oaks on the present site was moved to a site at the rear of the subdivision. I'm not going to go into all the details of who Covington was because I'm sort of getting close to our time. But just to give you a few other examples of some of their work, they also did design some skyscrapers. Contemporary with the Covington House is Edwards' 1927 Exchange Bank in Tallahassee, a mid-rise office tower considered to be the first modern private office tower in Tallahassee. Again, buff brick bank building, goes 6 stories up, and then after that, or actually one of his earlier buildings that Edwards did on his own when he was operating out of South Carolina is the Union National Bank, which I've compared it to, which in that case is actually neo-Gothic. Of course, near the seminary campus, at the end of the decade, Edwards and Sayward began to plan for the development of Agnes Scott College in Decatur. A perspective drawing of around 1930 shows the then existing campus buildings in pink, the buildings planned for imminent construction in yellow, and future buildings in green. Buttrick Hall, a brick and stone trimmed collegiate Gothic classroom building, was the first Edwards and Sayward building erected for Agnes Scott College. It was a masterful and picturesque exercise of the varied vocabulary of the Jacobean collegiate style. Cross gables, wall dormers, grouped windows with stone surround, oriel bays, open arcades, arched entries, stone coins, step buttresses, steep slate roofs. And after 50 years of service, the building was renovated by Henry Howard Smith, Francis Smith's son, 79, soon after he performed similar renovations and additions to the masterpiece of Edwards and Sayward on Agnes Scott, which was the campus library. The McCain Library was originally known as the Carnegie Library. There's the old, excuse me, I'm going to move ahead to the McCain. There we go. It was known as Carnegie Library. It retained the name of the original campus library that had been gifted by Andrew Carnegie in 1910. That first library, I know why I put that in there. Let me see if I can go back. That first library building became the school student center and was known as the Hub and was not raised until 1986. But that demolition left the campus without a student social center. So the Winship Walters Infirmary and the Booker Scott Gymnasium, which you see on the screen, were converted to serve as the first Wallace Alston Campus Center, which opened in 1988. And both the former infirmary and the gymnasium were finally demolished in 1999 and replaced by Thompson Ventilette and Steinbach's design for a new Alston Campus Center designed in that year. And that is a much more expansive one. But of course, the academic and scholastic and intellectual life of the college is centered at the Carnegie Library, built by Edwards and Sayward in 1936, and not renamed McCain Library until 1951 in honor of James Ross McCain, who was Agnes Scott's second president. He was just retiring at that point. Although its forms were less compact, its architectural language, neo-Gothic rather than Romanesque revival, the organization of formal elements and spaces recalls the several suburban libraries of the 1880s by H.H. Richardson. Those were, of course, in Romanesque style. Richardson designed wide projecting gabled entries accented with monumental semicircular arches flanked by a stair tower and beyond a reading room accented by grouped windows. Inside the entry, reception circulation desk space opening to a small reading room on one side and a grander, indeed monumental reading room lay opposite beneath an ornate ceiling. Much of that has been translated to Gothic at McCain Library. Edwards and Sayward's McCain Library reading room remains one of Atlanta's finest neo-Gothic interiors, following in the tradition of Harold Bush Brown's 1928 Britton Dining Hall at Georgia Tech, and paralleling Britton Hall's didactic intention as a follower of Ruskin's call for an architecture that speaks to us. At Britton, both in Julian Harris's south window glass and his carved heads along the outside arcade, figures painted and sculpted represent the fields of study, the very curriculum and disciplines, engineering, sciences, and arts of the engineering school. Agnes Scott is a liberal arts college, so references in the McCain Library include inscriptions to the humanities, the wisdom of noted writers of all ages. The March 4th, 1936 issue of the college newspaper noted the library's featured inscriptions ranged from a rondel supporting rampant unicorns for the main entry porch to a quote from Milton over the mantel of the main reading room to inscriptions on the concrete beams, 3 written in Greek from Plato, Phaedo, and others, as well as quotations from the Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, Shakespeare, and Henry Thoreau. Appropriate for the library, Plato advises students to, quote, seek ye first the good things of the mind, unquote. Both Buttrick Hall and McCain Library were renovated during the late 1970s by Henry Howard Smith, who also executed alterations in 1974 to Presser Hall, originally built in 1939 after Edwards' death. That is by Sayward and Logan. And here you can see a view of Presser. McCain Library and Presser Hall are surprisingly works of the Great Depression and the eve of World War II. Seemingly unconstrained by the events of the day, they also represent a turning point in the practice of Edwards and Sayward. Robert Logan had joined the firm by the mid-20s, and projects such as Campbell Hall and the general plan of Columbia Seminary identified the architects as Edwards and Sayward Architects, Robert Logan Associates. Several projects of the following decade up to the date of Pearl Harbor served to draw the practice of Edwards and Saywards to a conclusion, with Logan increasingly active from the war years on. A couple of postscript buildings that I should mention. The City Hall in Decatur, 1930. Edwards returned to his earlier interest in treating public architecture with tetra-style temple fronts. This Southern classical tradition had been evidenced in 1907 at his Carnegie Library, at the Florida State Normal and Industrial College for colored students, which is Florida A&M, in 1914, respectively also at the York and Jasper County courthouses in South Carolina, which we looked at last time. This is a more limited scale than some of those buildings, but follows a number of the same elements of the vocabulary. And 3 years later, the firm's United States Post Office and courthouse in Columbus, Georgia, appeared as a monumental example of New Deal era classicism, featuring a striking facade dominated by 6 giant order fluted Ionic columns, accented with terracotta polychromed inlaid panels and roundels, and in the 3 middle bays, 3 neoclassical entry doors accented with stylized overdoor cornices and pediments adorned with eagles. The building mass is capped with a red tile roof with multicolored terracotta edging. Well, after a rapid decline in the opening years of the decade, public building projects increased after the inauguration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the establishment of the New Deal. And an unusual project of Edwards and Sayward is university housing. It is the equivalent for public housing to Techwood housing, which was designed for whites. University housing was designed for blacks and was located right adjacent to Spelman College. The Techwood Homes is a work of Burgeon Stevens. University Homes is designed for black families by Edwards and Sayward. These were approved in 1933, built around 34. A year later, in September of 1934, the former Beaver Slide slum in Atlanta was demolished, with Edward Ickes, the Secretary of the Interior, pushing the plunge to set off the dynamite and make room for university homes. And again, I'm cognizant of the time, so I'm going to just not say a lot about this. This complex also, both Techwood Homes and University Homes, had landscape designed by William Pauly as well. All of that, of course, has been torn down because there was a widespread demolition of a good bit of the public housing. The University Homes, when completed, comprised 675 units, opened its doors to its first unit residence in April of 37, and 4 years later, Sayward and Logan were associated with architects Cooper and Cooper in the design of another 200 units of 21 public housing buildings at Allen Wilson Terrace in Decatur, which was just behind us beyond the newer courthouse. In 2009, as part of the citywide effort to improve public housing, Atlanta's historic New Deal public housing, including Techwood Homes, University Homes, and all of them were demolished as part of the HUD Hope 6 program. At University Homes, only the original administration building called Roosevelt Hall remains. Well, William Augustus Edwards died on March 30th in 1939. The firm continued practicing architecture for several years under the name of Sayward and Logan, with Logan increasingly taking over the lead role as designer, erecting Presser Hall at Agnes Scott, for instance, in 39 to 40. And soon after Sayward's death in 1945, Logan built one of his finer local works, the Emory Presbyterian Church from 46 to 8, a nice petite Gothic church not far from here. His work at Agnes Scott continued with the Letitia Pate Evans Dining Hall, which is a Logan and Williams project of 1950, originally built by Barge Thompson and renovated in 1999. Campbell Hall, Logan Williams from 51. And the huge sanctuary complex for Presbyterian Church, Peachtree Presbyterian Church, is also their work. Logan and Williams rounded out their practices in church and school architecture with two buildings that allow us to close out the historicist nature of this talk by looking at these final works, 6 identical dormitory buildings at the University of Georgia in Athens. Times have changed. These were completed in 1961. It's a complex known as the Hill Community, striking ensemble of flat-roofed red brick and dark green metal curtain-walled mid-century modern architecture. Today, the buildings survive with a high degree of integrity as classic post-war modern design. 5 of the dormitories, Church Hall, Hill Hall, Linscomb, Mell, and Boggs Hall, occupy a 51-acre parcel and continuous student housing, while the 6th, Tucker Hall, was located on the east side of campus and originally designated for agricultural program students, but now serves as offices and other academic uses. Between 2 4-story wings of unequal length, 5 and 7 bays of aluminum frame, glass, metal panels, each building's entry is marked by a hovering brick block above a glazed entry and elevator lobby. The ground floor beneath the bedroom wings displays painted concrete with 2 wings set back at very depth from the entry. A pinwheel effect is achieved. Stair towers at each end of the building provide egress from the double-loaded corridors. A long and low horizontal flow is reinforced by the flat roof and by the slope of the window sash and mullions. The Hill Community reflects the firm establishment of an entirely new aesthetic in school design. Gropius and the Bauhaus influenced modernism. The mid-century modern complex was completed in 1961, the year before Logan's death in 1962. Logan was the last of the triumvirate of school designers: William Edwards, William Sayward, Robert Logan. And by the 1960s, the architectural work of educational buildings had certainly changed. Thank you.